made my reach on his knees and like beg for forgiveness. He tied him up. Tied him up with something.
How does someone sit in a murder trial convinced nothing can touch him? The evidence looked thin, the witnesses stayed silent, and time kept passing. Confidence turned into arrogance inside the courtroom. Smiles replaced restraint. Disrespect replaced caution. What he miscalculated was not the law, but the people closest to him. Silence inside violent circles is never permanent. Pressure shifts loyalties. When survival outweighs fear, secrets surface. The moment one insider speaks, power collapses fast and control disappears. Courtroom confidence and the illusion of control. Bryce Rhodes entered the courtroom believing the system had already failed to catch him. By the time his trial began, years had passed since the murders. Physical evidence was limited. Surveillance footage did not exist. No eyewitnesses had come forward publicly. Investigators had struggled early, and that delay shaped his mindset. Time, in his view, had erased consequences. Every day without charges had reinforced the idea that silence worked. By the time he was finally facing a jury, he believed the hardest part was already over. That confidence showed in how he carried himself during proceedings. His behavior was not defensive or cautious. It was confrontational and dismissive. He treated the courtroom as an inconvenience rather than a threat. Observers noted repeated disruptions, visible irritation with authority, and a lack of restraint when addressed by the judge. Instead of minimizing attention, he drew it. Instead of signaling cooperation, he projected superiority. This posture was not accidental. It was rooted in how power had worked for him outside the courtroom. Inside his social circle, dominance had been enforced through fear and compliance. People around him followed instructions because consequences were immediate and personal. That dynamic shaped his expectations of the legal process. He assumed intimidation worked everywhere. He assumed no one would risk speaking against him. The absence of early arrests confirmed that belief. Each court appearance without a setback reinforced the idea that control remained firmly in his hands. What Rhodes failed to recognize was that courts operate on pressure, not fear. Time does not weaken cases evenly. While evidence can degrade, psychological strain accumulates. The longer a case lingers, the more pressure builds on those involved. People who once believed silence guaranteed safety begin to reassess their options. Fear of retaliation competes with fear of prison. Loyalty erodes quietly. Rhodes misread this shift completely. His courtroom demeanor also underestimated how juries interpret behavior. Jurors are instructed to weigh evidence, but they observe everything. Repeated signs of disrespect do not go unnoticed. Displays of arrogance undermine claims of victimization. When a defendant appears unconcerned with the gravity of the charges, it creates dissonance. That dissonance becomes suspicion. Rhodes treated the trial like a performance, but the audience was not passive. More critically, his confidence depended on the belief that everyone involved had something to lose by speaking. That assumption ignored a key reality. The people around him were not equally protected. Some faced long sentences. Some carried guilt that compounded over time. Some realized they had been disposable all along. Control built on fear holds only as long as the cost of silence feels lower than the cost of truth. By the time the trial reached its later stages, the balance had already shifted. What Rhodes interpreted as stability was actually stagnation before collapse. His public confidence masked private vulnerability. The system he relied on depended entirely on others continuing to protect him. That dependency was his greatest weakness. The courtroom confidence that once signaled dominance would soon highlight how little control he truly had. The missing evidence that was never really gone. From the outside, the case against Bryce Rhodes appeared fragile. Investigators had no usable surveillance footage. The crime scene itself had been destroyed. The bodies were discovered burned at an abandoned property, eliminating forensic clarity. Early interviews produced denials, half-truths, and confusion. No one volunteered a full account. For years, that absence shaped public perception. It looked like a case built on suspicion rather than proof. Rhodes relied on that perception heavily. What he misunderstood was the nature of modern homicide investigations. Cases without immediate evidence are not abandoned. They are slowed. Detectives continued to document inconsistencies, track associations, and preserve partial records. Phone data, location history, and social connections were quietly mapped. Even without a clear physical trail, the structure of events was being outlined. Time allowed investigators to refine questions rather than rush conclusions. The absence of evidence also had a psychological effect on those involved. People who believed the case had gone cold began living differently. Complacency replaced caution. Conversations loosened. Stories changed subtly over time. Those changes were noticed. When multiple accounts shift independently, patterns emerge. Investigators compare those shifts carefully. Contradictions do not need to be dramatic to be meaningful. Small deviations accumulate. Rhodes mistook silence for erasure. He assumed that because no one spoke publicly, nothing remained. In reality, the silence itself became data. Investigators documented who refused to cooperate, who avoided interviews, and who abruptly changed routines. These behaviors narrowed focus. Attention is consolidated rather than dispersed. When pressure increases slowly, targets often fail to notice, until movement becomes impossible. Another miscalculation involved the role of accomplices. Rhodes treated involvement as shared liability, assuming mutual exposure guaranteed loyalty. That assumption ignored individual thresholds. Not everyone carries risk the same way. Some participants fear prison more than retaliation. Others cannot tolerate the psychological weight of prolonged secrecy. The longer the case remained unresolved, the heavier that weight became. Behind the scenes, prosecutors evaluated leverage. They examined which participants faced the most exposure and which had the least protection. Deals are not offered randomly, they are calculated responses to pressure points. A case that appears weak publicly can still be strong privately if it identifies a single structural failure. In this case, that failure was human endurance. By the time testimony emerged, it did not fill gaps randomly. It aligned with what investigators already suspected. The details provided were not isolated claims. They matched timelines, locations, and behavioral evidence gathered quietly over the years. That alignment transformed fragments into a coherent narrative. Rhodes believed evidence only existed in visible form. He overlooked memory, guilt, and fear as evidentiary forces. Physical traces can be burned. People cannot be erased as easily. When one participant decided survival mattered more than silence, the case shifted instantly. What once looked empty revealed structure. What looked buried surfaced intact. The social hierarchy that enabled violence. The environment surrounding Bryce Rhodes was not chaotic, it was structured. Authority did not come from formal titles or written rules, but from reputation and demonstrated control. Decisions were centralized, others deferred automatically. That hierarchy shaped how conflicts were handled and how violence escalated. When authority is unquestioned, hesitation disappears. actions that would normally provoke resistance become routine. Rodas occupied a dominant position within his circle. His influence was reinforced through intimidation and unpredictability. People complied not because they agreed, but because resistance carried immediate consequences. This created a culture where silence was expected, and dissent was dangerous. Once established, that culture sustained itself. New participants adapted quickly or were removed. Violence functioned as enforcement rather than exception. Rodas exploited that mechanism. He understood that forcing involvement created mutual exposure. Once someone crossed a line, withdrawal became impossible. The hierarchy ensured compliance even after the initial act. Cleanup, transport, and concealment were extensions of the same control. Each step reinforced dependence on silence. However, hierarchical systems are fragile when removed from their environment. What enforces obedience in private spaces loses effectiveness under legal pressure. Authority based on fear weakens when consequences shift from immediate violence to long-term incarceration. Inside a courtroom, the hierarchy disappears. The leader becomes isolated. Followers regain individual identities. That transition is where systems like Rodas's fail. Outside, dissent meant retaliation. Inside, silence meant prison. The calculus changed. Loyalty offered no protection once charges escalated. The same hierarchy that once ensured control now concentrated blame. When testimony became an option, participants reassessed their position. Rodas misjudged the durability of his influence. He assumed fear translated beyond his presence. He assumed silence was permanent. He failed to understand that hierarchical control does not survive institutional pressure. Courts dismantle informal power structures methodically. Each participant is separated, evaluated, and pressured individually. The system that once enabled violence also created its undoing. By placing himself at the center of every decision, Rodas ensured that when the structure collapsed, responsibility flowed upward. The hierarchy protected him briefly. In the end, it isolated him completely. The insider who carried too much weight. Antoine Carter was never positioned as a leader. He existed on the periphery of control, close enough to see what happened, far enough to feel replaceable. That position is often the most unstable. Peripheral participants absorb risk without authority. They witness violence without directing it. They follow orders without shaping outcomes. Over time, that imbalance becomes intolerable. Carter's involvement placed him inside the event, but outside its justification. He was present when decisions were made, but he did not benefit from them. He carried exposure without insulation. Unlike Rodas, he did not command fear. Unlike others, he did not distance himself early. His role forced proximity to the consequences while offering no long-term protection. That combination produces a psychological fracture. Silence became a burden rather than a shield. The longer the time passed, the heavier it grew. Carter was not insulated by status or reputation. He was vulnerable to arrest, prosecution, and retaliation simultaneously. Each day without resolution increased anxiety. The case lingered in the background of his life, shaping choices and limiting options. He could not move freely. He could not plan long-term. Survival became short-term and reactive. What Rodas failed to recognize was that Carter's position made him the weakest link. Weakness in criminal systems is not defined by morality. It is defined by imbalance. Carter had more to lose by staying silent than by speaking eventually. That calculation does not happen suddenly. It develops under sustained pressure. Legal exposure amplified that pressure. As investigations continued, Carter understood that the absence of charges did not equal safety. It meant uncertainty. Uncertainty is corrosive. It erodes confidence and increases paranoia. Every interaction becomes suspect. Every knock carries weight. Fear shifts from immediate retaliation to inevitable accountability. Carter also lacked a support structure that could withstand long-term stress. Loyalty inside violent circles is conditional. It is enforced through presence. Once distance grows, protection weakens. Carter could not rely on the same mechanisms that Rhodes assumed were permanent. He was isolated long before he decided to speak. When prosecutors identified him as a pressure point, the imbalance became explicit. He faced the reality of potential life imprisonment for actions he did not initiate. Cooperation offered an exit. Silence offered collapse. That is not a moral dilemma, it is a survival calculation. Courts understand this dynamic and use it deliberately. The decision to testify was not impulsive. It was the result of accumulated strain. Guilt played a role, but fear played a larger one. Carter understood that the system would not forget him. He understood that delay increased risk. Cooperation transformed him from a target to an asset. That shift altered his position immediately. The moment loyalty became a liability. Loyalty inside violent networks is often misunderstood. It is not built on trust or shared values, it is built on mutual exposure. As long as everyone carries comparable risk, silence holds. The moment that balance shifts, loyalty becomes dangerous. In this case, that shift occurred long before anyone testified. It began when legal pressure stopped being abstract. As investigators refined their case, individual risk profiles changed. Some participants realized they faced far harsher consequences than others. Roles that once felt minor began to look catastrophic under scrutiny. The difference between following an order and giving one became legally significant. That distinction mattered. Those who did not initiate violence faced a different future than those who controlled it. For Rhodes, loyalty was assumed rather than maintained. He believed past intimidation guaranteed future compliance. He failed to reinforce protection or reassurance. Silence was treated as an obligation, not a negotiated condition. That neglect allowed doubt to grow. When individuals feel abandoned, loyalty erodes rapidly. The courtroom behavior that Rhodes displayed reinforced that erosion. Public arrogance signals confidence, but it also signals indifference. To those carrying risk on his behalf, it communicated expendability. He appeared unconcerned with shared consequences. That perception matters. When leaders seem insulated, followers reassess allegiance. Once prosecutors offered Carter a path out, loyalty inverted. Silence no longer protected him. It endangered him. Testimony, while costly, offered survival. That calculation reframed past loyalty as liability. Protecting Rhodes meant sacrificing his own future. No system based on fear can survive that moment. The legal system exploits this vulnerability deliberately. It does not require moral awakening. It requires differential incentives. Cooperation reduces exposure. Silence increases it. Once that structure is clear, outcomes become predictable. Someone speaks. When they do, others lose leverage. Rhodes underestimated how quickly loyalty dissolves under asymmetric pressure. He believed fear functioned indefinitely. He ignored that fear must be reinforced to remain effective. Time without reinforcement weakens control. Time under legal scrutiny destroys it. When Carter took the stand, loyalty had already collapsed internally. The testimony did not cause the betrayal. It revealed it. The relationship between them had shifted months earlier. What remained was formality. That moment marked the irreversible change in the case. The prosecution no longer relied on circumstantial inference. It had narrative coherence. Loyalty, once Rodas' shield, became evidence against him. The system he trusted to protect him transformed into the mechanism that ensured his conviction.